Welcome, everyone. I'm Deacon Vicki Hanrahan, Assistant to the Bishop for Synodical Life. Thanks again for joining us for this Equipping the Saints webinar, where we pause in our day for holy conversations with Bishop Rogness and with each other. Today's topic is At the Crossroads of Fear and Faith, Current and Future Plans for In-Person Protocols. Bishop Rogness will explain the hour and how it will work, but as ever, throughout the hour, feel free to write questions or comments in the chat area that come to mind, and he will address those as possible. Also a note that we're recording this webinar for those who are unable to attend it live, and of course for you if you want to go back and reference anything. The recording will be available to you from the Synod's website, www.scsw-elca.org/webinars. So let's take a moment to get centered and open with a word of prayer. Holy and immortal one, we find ourselves at the crossroads of fear and faith. Help us to be aware of our fears and their hold on us. In the midst of all that is changing around us, give us insights into how to move forward. And while doing so, help us to claim the faith that through you, all things are possible. Help us to be still long enough to hear your voice that reveals how we might serve your greater purpose. And as we turn our fears into sacred callings, give us the courage and energy we need to create something new and life-giving that has as its central purpose bringing others into a life-changing relationship with your Son, our risen Lord. We ask all of this through your holy name. Amen. Bishop Rogness, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Vicki, and thanks to all of you for being part of what I like Vicki's phrase, holy conversation. That's what these are. I have always liked, there's a phrase in Luther's phrase in the Small Called Articles where he's talking about the sacraments of the church, and in a way that almost make it sound like an additional sacrament, he uses the phrase, the mutual conversation and consolation of the saints. Actually, he says brethren, but we know he meant saints. But mutual conversation and consolation, the kind of thing that happens when faith community gather, is at the heart of God's grace being showered on us. And when we can't gather, this takes its place. And I've found great value in these. So thanks to all of you. As Vicki said, let me frame what I have in mind for some direction in this conversation that will still have plenty of time for back and forth and so on. In the larger scope of things, you recall that we started these as COVID descended on us, and we thought it helpful to have an opportunity just to be talking about how are we coping, what are we learning, how are we responding, just to be able to talk with each other about that. And I've found that helpful, and judging by the fact we keep getting a bunch of people tuning in, apparently some of you find it a good way to spend an hour as well, which I'm not surprised for. So I appreciate that. Several times along the way, we have moved into some other focus topics. After George Floyd's killing, we had several weeks where including our week with Everett Mitchell, where that really took front and center. Last week, and again next week, most of our conversation will center on the upcoming election of a bishop in this synod. But this week, we'll return to that original focus of these conversations about how we are responding and how we are going about making decisions in the life of the church, where we're at. Next week we'll have the three bishops, Mark Hansen, Stan Olsen, and Andrea de Groot-Nesdal with us. And then the week after that, the 18th, will be our last time together like this for the month, because the week right before assembly, we won't be doing this. So that's where we are in the broader sweep of things. So let me frame today. Um, in most of our discussions in the past, especially as you've gone into breakout groups, it's been an opportunity to just say, well, what's happening in your place? And each person sort of tells what's happening there, and you learn from each other and just get a sort of a wider frame of reference for those kinds of things. We're going to do that sort of thing, but with a little more focus this time. I want to frame the question this way, recognizing that in March, when most in-person worship stopped, I don't think most of us thought that nearly 5 months later we'd still be asking the question, so how do we come back together again? And some are trying this, some are trying that. But it's gone on a long time. It's summer, not a lot of programming happens in the summer, so it seemed to be okay to just continue along. Now we're hitting fall and we're starting to look down the road as people are saying, this could be with us for a long time. We may not just sort of go through a slump and now return to normal. This could be a long time thing. So we're all faced with decisions. Every local congregation is faced with making decisions about how do we cope with that? How do we respond? How do we pull together together as a family of faith? How do we come form community in person again? You know from conversations with each other that right now people are there's a little bit of everything going on. Some are still doing entirely remote, nothing in person. Some have taken advantage of this time of year and been doing outdoor worship, some outdoors lawn chairs, many in parking lot kinds of worship. Some have begun to do with with guardrails around it, in-person worship in congregations. We've seen all of that. But we all have this matter now on our front burner of how do we make decisions and what are the coming weeks and how do we navigate our way through. So the question I want you to wrestle with when we go into breakout groups in a minute, and we thought we'll put most of your breakout groups should have 4 people in it, and we'll give you 12 minutes, so each person has at least 2-3 minutes anyway, and for a conversation. But I want you to ask the question: not just what's going on in your place, but why is it going on? What are the key criteria that are driving the decisions about worship in your place? What are the key criteria? What are the thresholds that people are thinking you have to cross in order to do such and such? You remember way back in Badger Bounce Back, they thought this was going to be very methodical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and there were thresholds for each, and this isn't working out quite that way. But what are the bases on which your people in your place, your council members and so on, what are the key driving criteria? Let me give you some for instances. In the beginning, I think in those first weeks that we're out, a lot of people were taking the counsel of both kind of the general health department, government better shut down. So the ELCA, our synod, Wisconsin Council of Churches, all came out with guidance about holding off and what that might look like. So that a lot of people just relied on what the church was saying. As time has gone on, many people look at what the government's saying, what the CDC says, what are their guidelines, or county governments in some places. Dane County's been very active, for instance, in issuing specific guidelines. Are those the key driving criteria, or are there other health professionals? In your conversations in your place, are you citing what Dr. Osterholm or Dr. Fauci or Dr. So-and-so are saying? Or is it other things? Is it For some of you, I know you've talked about the pressure of neighboring congregations. What are other congregations in your community doing? And that that has shaped some of your local decision making. Some of you have talked about simply the impatience of your own people. Nuts to all the caution, we've been away from each other long enough, we want to get back together again, regardless of the risk. What I'm getting at is there's a number of these specific criteria, these thresholds, these drivers of your decision. So when you go into your groups now for the next 12 minutes, compare notes about what are the primary drivers of the decision in your place. And it may not be the same, obviously, for all four of you. That's part of the value of this conversation. And then, now here's a new wrinkle. Then take a look at what breakout group number you're being assigned. You know, when it says you're going into breakout group, it says you will join breakout group number 5 or something like that. Well, pay attention. And when you get the little notice that your breakout group is about to end in 59 seconds, decide who of you is going to quickly summarize what the driving criteria that your group talked about were. And we'll just quickly go around breakout group. We don't, frankly, I hate reporting back in from small group meetings. It's like being stoned to death with popcorn usually, but it's, but we'll do this quick. You don't have to rehearse your whole discussion, just kind of quick. These were the criteria we mostly talked about. And we'll quick get a survey of what has emerged in each of those groups. Okay? Well, let's just do this. Call out the numbers of the breakout rooms in order. And as I said, just little, doesn't have to be exhaustive covering everything. You don't have to be so diplomatic that you make sure you report something that each person said. Just a bit or two that stands out in your mind of what you came up with in terms of what are the drivers of the conversations in the discussion in the congregations that your discussion participants are in. So who's reporting for breakout group number 1?
I am. This is Vicki. Yep, I drew the short straw. Okay, so everything's interesting to me, but the things that I found that were common, seems that everybody is looking at guidelines in one way or the other. So Dane County guidelines, some have surveyed council members. These are the things that have driven the driving force behind coming back together. One in particular I thought was interesting was younger people eager to get back together that were the driving force on a task team. One congregation got permission, local permission from the Sheriff's Department in addition to looking at the CDC directives, so following county guidelines. So those were basically the driving forces, just the need in general to get together for, spiritual wellness and being together as a family again. The things our congregations in our group are doing, as a lot of them are doing outdoor worship. They are doing, one of them is doing a pastor on the patio once a week in addition to outdoor worship for an hour. And they're also doing a combination of that in Zoom. We do have one congregation in our group that is doing inside worship. They removed a lot of the chairs in their worship space to create more safe space. So they are doing a maximum of 30 indoors with masks and no singing. And then they're folding chairs so they can clean the chairs after each use. Some outdoor worship that's going on, they're serving communion as they leave on a tray. So that helps people not to linger at the church, rather get their communion on the way out, and then if they feel they want to gather separately somewhere else, they can. One church is doing Wednesday practice, so they're having worship on Wednesdays with smaller groups to practice for when they will come back together as a larger group on Sunday. The Wednesday service is smaller. a little bit calmer group of people.
Okay, thanks. Before I call on number 2, if thoughts occur to you or questions about something that's been said occur to you, stick it in the chat room and we'll take a look at what all has appeared there when we're done seeing what the groups have come up with. Okay, group 2. Who's reporting for group 2?
It would be me, Michelle Elfers. We had a mix of 2 congregations are doing indoor in-person worship, one outdoor in the parking lot, the other one only online. Factors kind of included what push from congregation members in different ways, misunderstandings, and of the statistics is kind of pushing towards indoor versus outdoor, or inside gathering versus not gathering and just doing out online gathering. What the health official and the statistics are statewide and locally is a big factor. Stories of what's going on in other congregations is a huge factor, and then just personal stories of knowing what's going on in the lives of the different people and leaders of the congregations.
Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised to hear that personal stories, I suspect as time goes, the longer time goes on, the more personal stories begin to have an impact when it hits home and people realize how serious this is, how sick somebody can get because they know of it, not just watched it on the news. That can be pretty transformative when it hits close to home and gives a different flavor to the conversation. Okay, group 3.
That would be me. Yeah, so we did talk about, a couple different people mentioned local, county or city guidelines as a factor. Primarily, so 5 congregations, 2 meeting in person, 1 meeting in parking lot, 2 online. One of the online congregations had been meeting in person and then had an incident where a family in the church was exposed. So we talked about a lot of our congregations and even our leaders are experiencing a disparity of reality or a kind of cognitive dissonance that can't really happen here. So to speak to what you were just saying, Bishop, about it hasn't hit home yet and there's a denial, even, you know, well, there may be cases in town, but they're not our people. Most of our congregations, the pastor seemed to be primarily pushing safety decisions, whether that's not to meet or even the restrictions on how we meet. Although council and worship teams were certainly involved in making decisions. The age of the congregation is a factor for some congregations in deciding whether or not to resume. Yeah.
Good. You made mention of the pastor often having to be the one bringing to bear the health realities, the concern. I think that's an unfortunate burden that's not uncommon that pastors end up carrying. And I don't know what more to say about that other than just a word of encouragement. I think it's good and faithful work when the pastor accepts that and does that, but it's always nicer to have thoughtful and knowledgeable people surrounding you making those decisions. I should have invited people as they speak to identify themselves. You all know Vicki, who reported for Group 1 because she starts all of these as a staff person. Michelle Elfers was Group 2, pastor in Richland Center, and Lucy and I are just pastor down in Beloit. So Group 4, who is reporting for Group 4?
Well, we didn't pick anybody, but I guess I can do it. This is Kirsten Curtis. I'm in Spring Green. And we talked about some of the factors that are involved in ours are kind of pressure from other congregations that are not Lutheran in our area. In Dane County, those churches that have been in Dane County have been fortunate because there have been some pretty succinct guidelines that have been provided for churches and gathering and what that looks like. So that's been helpful. And then the smaller couple of our congregations are meeting in person outdoors. They're small, smaller congregations, so that was helpful because you can spread out. And then one congregation is meeting in person, but they're very small and they're able to spread out, and they are actually meeting in the sanctuary, wearing masks, running the air conditioning prior to when church starts, and then shutting it off so that the ventilation isn't causing problems for people in the congregation. So those are some of the factors that were involved in our areas. And a couple of the churches had task force that were doing ongoing work and providing information and guidance to support the pastor. So that was helpful as well.
Very good. Thanks, Kirsten.
Mm-hmm.
Group, what are we at? 5.
I am for group 5. We talked about the different ways that we're worshiping. There are 2 churches among us that have only so far done a distribution of communion as far as worship. And one thing that we talked about was noticing that the churches that were doing that maybe once monthly were having more of a turnout for that than churches that were doing that every week. 2 of the churches now have an option or have done a thing where you can go inside if you wish to, but they're still having things outdoors. And they've noticed that people just really aren't taking that option. At one church, 2 people went inside when they had the option to go in the building. And in another church that was a very large church, they've only had, it sounds like 8 people. Or 8 to 10 people going inside the building. And so there's just not a comfort level for going inside the building yet. Anything else? There have been another thing where it sounds like the pastor on the patio kind of idea where people can drive up for pastoral care. And it sounds like the pastor is inside some glass doorways for that. And so there's a barrier there and it's a drive up kind of thing where you can talk to the pastor. Anything else? In one county where they did open up the church building, they did so because the cases in that county actually are dropping, and there's a very small number in that particular county. And I just shared a story too about my congregation where we were going to have outdoor worship a week ago Sunday, but it turned out that one of the people who was helping to set up our outdoor drive-up communion actually tested positive for COVID, which resulted in me being exposed, which I'm not positive. I had a test, but that incident made the council decide to postpone outdoor worship until this coming Sunday.
And Kayla, and you're what congregation?
I'm Christ Lutheran in Sharon.
Okay. That's not the only situation I've heard of. I've heard of some others where things are moving forward, and then something, either in one case a personal encounter with it within the congregation, and in another case just the spike in numbers, the decision was to back off of plans for more in-person worship. Group 6.
Nancy Robbie at Holy Trinity in Marshall. We didn't talk so much about what we're doing, but just what was driving the decisions that we're making.
Right.
And we're all paying close attention to the Wisconsin Council of Churches guidelines and the information they're releasing. Some of us are listening to Michael Osterholm, who's a very well-recognized epidemiologist. Others of us are contacting our county health departments directly to get more information. And I myself have called the Wisconsin Council of Churches a couple of times to get clarifications, and we're finding good responses from that. just the local health orders, and just trying to be as well informed as possible in every way. The state figures, what's being released by the state in terms of the rates of infection. And one of our congregations had a couple of nursing home deaths that were due to COVID. And so that has been a sobering experience for the congregation and making them take it all more seriously. Another one of our more rural congregations, there's a lot of skepticism among the members about this in general that some of us have to deal with. So basically, the orders that are coming out and the information that's being released by trusted experts.
Thanks, Nancy. You mentioned the Wisconsin Council of Churches. I did too at the beginning, and Nancy made reference to new guidelines that they issued last week, which actually call on churches to consider backing off for another 6 weeks or so into mid-September. When I saw that, I was appreciative of it. I also wondered, I wonder how many places, it's been so hard to make decisions to go ahead, how many will be influenced by that statement to back off. But it's reasoning worth looking at. They bank on good people to shape their recommendations at the Council of Churches.
And I might add that they also tell us we better be looking at Advent and Christmas now. And we discuss that in our group as well.
Yeah, right. Group 7.
Fred Rilling from St. John's Lutheran Church in Prairie du Sac, Group 7. We had one person who's in a skilled nursing home setting, and so what's happening there is nothing until a vaccine. There is, excuse me. There is a closed circuit television setup in that particular scenario. Other people talked about having some small in-building groups sign up for that, no singing communion, kind of the standard thing that we've talked about a lot. But what's driving their decisions were comments made by the county and looking at trending numbers versus specific number. Another situation only online right now. There were plans for going outside or meeting inside in July. But again, because of the reports and transitions and changes, they were in Dane County, things went back to online only. The other one was mostly everything is online right now, looking at possibly doing outdoor worship as a possibility. And this has been a very specific thing for me to think about, this whole business of how do you decide things. And I think we've been talking about the notion of safety and how can we do things safely. And I think that's been the problem, that we are not safe. It is a dangerous situation that gets brought to our attention when somebody dies or somebody gets sick. But in the meantime, none of us should be surprised that people are going to get sick and die. And yet we seem to live in a world that kind of denies that. And so I've been using the metaphor of, yes, it is safer to swim with sharks than it is piranhas, but it's really not too safe.
Good metaphor. That one will stick. Thanks. Thanks, Fred. Oh, and Fred didn't introduce himself. Fred Rilling from Sauk City. Group 8.
I'm reporting in for Group 8. This is Group 8. This is Matt Polk at St. John's in Evansville. We're doing the same breadth of activities, so I won't review that. I'd say the key drivers are also similar. County health, national health guidelines, those kinds of things. We had pretty good consensus on fairly low pressure to gather in person, fairly low pressure. Some of the driving things we talked about were the economy and the local economy needing to resume activity for the sake of livelihood. We talked about mental and emotional health and people's sense of isolation and need for connection as a driving force. the different responses in nearby states, Iowa and Illinois, and how they're responding so differently and how that is influencing the local conversation. We talked about age of members as well being a key factor, and I'd add to that also one of our factors is having some key people in our congregation with pre-existing conditions, not necessarily elderly, but some of our young adults, some of our middle-aged members who are well known in our congregation, and we can all say, wow, think of this person. What if they got sick? That would be really hard on them. So that's also been a driving factor in our caution, I would say.
Thanks, Matt. Group 9. And I think Group 9 is Jim Hearn, but I don't.
That would be us, Jim Hearn, Barneville Lutheran Church. I'm going to echo a lot of Matt's thoughts and just share that our group kind of has the spectrum of doing outdoor, in person in the building with trying to keep the numbers even below the minimum to maintain safety. And then online, I think the driving force, which we shared about, was kind of surrounding ourselves with well knowledgeable people from the congregation and community to help make the decision, so it's not falling on us. And that, me personally here, I'm expecting baby number 3 early October, so the congregation has been very sympathetic and understanding and doesn't want to do anything that would put myself or my wife or the baby in harm's way. So, you know, where you're hearing a lot of stories of kind of people being frustrated and anger, there's some real goodness and kindness and understanding, compassion going on too. So that's kind of what our group talked about.
Good, thanks, Jim. Group 10. I actually don't know how many groups we had. Did we have a 10?
Yep, we got 10. I'm Steve Ristow Hansen from First English in Whitewater. And our group had all of us doing online worship and various kinds of ministry. One of our churches had their first parking lot worship last week. Our church in Whitewater is probably going to decide tonight to have a parking lot worship service at the end of this month. Criteria were different for each of our churches. Some is the church council, the age of the congregation and the council members, the underlying health conditions of council members and congregation members, and then health criteria at somewhat at the state level, but more at the county level. And there's a big contrast between Dane County, which has much stricter criteria, and the outlying counties, which seem to, including Walworth County, where I am, have much looser criteria. But our congregation had a regathering task force to make recommendations to the council, which the council adopted last Sunday, and they focus on the trends. So if there's a 7-day trend upward, then people start getting ready to maybe have some in person. After 14 days, that's allowable within all of the guidelines, but that can also be dialed down if there's a trend downwards, so that we can quickly back off of that as well.
Good. So a lot of attention to health department guidance and directives for your decisions. Good.
Right.
Number 11. Breakout group 11. Did we have an 11?
Well, there wasn't exactly an 11, but there was a, let's see. There was a group of us that were just in the regular room, so we'll call us 11. Okay. and I'll talk about that. You know, a lot of the same things that everyone's been talking about, kind of the churches are looking at science before they go back, or one of the churches is not back to in-person worship, but all of the churches around them are. So that's kind of a, you know, difficult situation, I would say. But that church also has a group of people who are very strong in helping research when the best time to go back is. And you know, one of the churches saying they're having outdoor worship, but they're still encouraging people to wear masks at that time, even outside, because people are so excited to be back together that they are having a hard time staying away from each other. You know, I can just imagine being able to see everyone from my church, and I'm gonna want to hug them, and it's probably gonna be hard not to. So that's a real good thing. You know, one of the churches, he was saying that they were planning an outdoor worship, but it's kind of led by making sure that the congregation knows that they're, you know, that they're still there. They're still wanting to help them, because a lot of the congregation is needing that support. And even just planning an outdoor worship or something that's different is a good way to let them know that. So that's
Okay,
basically what we talked about in room number 11.
thank you. I've been looking in the chat room. There were a couple interesting comments in the chat room. There are several having to do with to what degree are we looking to decisions that schools are now having to make. That's all happening just now. Is school districts are now up against having to decide: do we come back in person? Do we do it all remotely? Do we do a hybrid of it? But I wasn't hearing that that's an easily translatable or transferable set of criteria for people in person worship. There are different factors at work. But that was an interesting observation. Nancy Robbie posted the Council of Churches recommendations, the link to it if you're curious about that. And Eric Bakken managed to get in a pitch for the Sugar Creek Bible Camp golf tournament. So nice job, Eric. I'd make one closing comment, and then I'm going to kick it to Vicki, because we've now made some decisions about the technological side of this Synod Assembly that's coming up. So the sooner we can get word out and have people beginning to understand how all that's going to work, the better. So she'll talk a little bit about that before we end. I had two comments. One was, I had, some of you know our oldest daughter married a Norwegian, lives in Bergen, Norway, has for the last 20 years. So we have grandchildren over there. We get over there now and then. So we watch what happens in that country a lot. And I just watched a video from a piece that said, why is it that Norway's numbers are so low? And the piece included a video clip of their prime minister and several other officials on March 12th. Now remember where this all was at March 12th. Norway had not had a COVID death yet by that time, but the prime minister got up and announced a whole series of very stringent stay-at-home shutdown orders. And the whole point of what she said was, this is what we do as a people to care for each other. We now have to do this. We have pulled together at other times as a country to get through hard times. They're still very aware, frankly, of the Nazi occupation. But they say this is what we do as a country because we take care of each other. Now, our free market people will say, well, they're a socialist state, and they're, you know, and they are. But it's all based on an ethic of taking care of one another. I'm not arguing for us becoming Norway. What I am arguing is for an elevation of that ethic, that we make decisions based on how we best care for one another. The health department are making issuing guidelines. not for the sake of increasing the health industry budget or anything. They're making it because their job is to care for the health of the whole of our people, which is very consistent with our theological ethic of caring for the whole of the people whose life we help steward. So I hope in the midst of all of these discussions, we continue to overlay a theological framework on the conversations that we're having. How best do we steward the life of our people in these times in a way that gives evidence of our care, of the fact that our care for one another and for the world is at the heart of who we are as a church. End of sermon. Anyway, thanks for this conversation. I'm heartened, frankly, by how many of you are reporting really thoughtful people coming together to guide thoughtful discussions, careful and caring discussions about shaping these decisions in your place. I hope it was helpful for you to hear from one another. Next week, we will, I'll be having 3 of my friends. I'll tell you at the beginning of that hour why I picked them to be with us. Anyway, and they will, as I did last week, they will simply shape some reflections on the office of bishop. Not only what do you look for as you go about electing a bishop, but another element of that conversation is going to be, what advice might they give us as a synod for how we enter into the ministry of a bishop in a way that positions that ministry to be successful, not just for the bishop, but for the whole of the synod. So that's sort of where we're going next week with that conversation. Thanks for this time together. Vicki, you were going to talk a little bit about synod assembly.
Right, thank you. So now I'm going to ask you to really put on your detail hat. This really is about how we are church together. Since this is such a unique synod assembly, I'm going to ask you to pay attention more than you ever have before to any written communications, any communications that come out of the synod office on how this is all going to work. But let me explain it to you here on the call. Because for any of you that have not registered your voting members, you want to understand what they're going to need to participate in assembly. Right now, we're at about 305 already registered, so we're in good shape. On Friday, we sent to all rostered leaders an updated assembly book with new information on our video conference and how it will work. If you haven't read that, you'll want to do that. It has a lot of details in it, especially in the information pages of the Synod Assembly book. We also posted this information to the Assembly page on the Synod website, and it's quite simple, actually. What is going to happen to participate in the video conference is we are going to provide every voting member with a URL in an email that we send to you and to them, that they will click on to get to the Lumi webinar platform. We're using a company called Lumi Global Services, and they work with Zoom in concert. So your attendees will click on the Lumi link that we send. They will enter their personal email address and a password that we send to them. And since this combination of the two things, the personal email address and the password, serves as their credentials as a voting member, they must have their own unique email address. I looked at the list this morning. We only have 2 couples that share an email address, so we'll work with the pastor of those 2 couples to make sure that they know how easy it is to add a Gmail account. But if you do have couples that share an address, they should set themselves up with their own personal email address. So they click on the URL from the landing page, the Zoom window will open. They will have a one-click entree into the voting platform and very easy to work. We're going to be providing some additional instructions on how to ask a question, how to make a point of order, and so forth. So we're going to be sending also to all voting members a link to a 9-minute video that is a tutorial that every voting member will want to watch. And you can watch it as many times as you want to feel comfortable with doing it. And while this is not rocket science, if you try to orient yourself at the last minute, it's going to be difficult. So as we understand, some people are more technically savvy and comfortable with computer technology than others. We recommend that you take advantage of watching that short video as many times as you need to be comfortable. We are also going to be holding 2 practices the night before assembly in which voting members should log on and practice together. And we'll have another instructional video. And by the way, we'll send invitations out to everybody who's registered to these things. And we will have another instructional video that we will show at 8:15 on the morning of assembly. That'll be another review. And then another 4-minute video specific to how to vote right before we take the first vote at Synod Assembly. So with all these things together, we feel that we're doing as much as possible to assure that voting members are equipped to give voice and to vote successfully at Synod Assembly. If you still feel your voting members need assistance, you might consider having a watch party at your church. It would be nice for people to participate from the comfort of their home because it'll be a long day. They'll want to take comfort breaks. They can get up and have lunch and do their thing. But if you have people that are just not comfortable doing it themselves, you can set up a watch party at your church. If you do this, we do ask that you still follow the recommended safety guidelines from the CDC. And please call me if you're interested in doing that for more information on that. We are going to be stricter with registration deadlines this year as we have a lot to do once registration closes this year. So please know that your folks must be registered by August 14th. And another date to put on your calendar is August 17th. We will be holding a hearing on the 2021 spending plan and compensation guidelines. As we've often done at our in-person assemblies, we hold hearings so that people have an opportunity to ask questions, to socialize the information, so that they can have a more thoughtful input into the vote. And it also helps to expedite the voting process. So we will be doing that, but we'll be doing it via webinar so that your voting members can attend that and participate in that. And then we'll move more efficiently through the voting process on those 2 items on the 29th. So that hearing will be on the evening of August 17th from 7 to 8:30. Watch What Matters for all these updates. I'll try to put them in the first 3 pages of What Matters until we get to Synod Assembly. Feel free to call me with any questions. Thanks for your attention. That was a lot of information, but I hope it was helpful.
And that information will be coming repeatedly. I said to Vicki, I've watched the Lumi video, and I've said to Vicki, I think people ought to watch it 2 or 3 times, because after you've watched it, then it's what initially it sounds very complicated becomes much more understandable. It's really pretty simple stuff, but it's different from what we've done. So thanks, Vicki.
Sure.
And thanks to all of you. A couple of questions did come in the chat room, particularly, do we have to re-register people? No, if they've been registered for the Synod Assembly, they are still registered. Fred's, well, the other stuff we'll answer. Fred's asking, will a link to the webinar to our voting members, all of that stuff will be communicated as the time gets shorter. Well, we've gone a few minutes past, but I thank you for your patience in staying with it. Anything else, Vicki?
No, just watch What Matters, please. Thank you.
Thank you all for being with us. We'll see you again next week.
Have a great week.